This is podcast A Different Lens, a audio podcast brought to you by the Hampton Institute, a working class think tank. Today we're interviewing Jeriah Bowser, the Ecology and Sustainability Department Chair, on his most recent article, To Wrench or Not to Wrench? A brief history of direct action in the environmental movement and the potential consequences, ethical implications, and effectiveness. How are you doing
Pretty
today,
good,
Jeriah?
man. How about yourself? No.
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, man.
So in regards to this article, my first question is, what prompted you to even write this article? Because it seems like a topic that people somewhat know about, but it isn't really talked about very much.
Yeah, I think there's two real reasons what prompted me to write it. One is after writing my last article for the Hampton Institute, titled "Rejecting Dystopia." Basically, it dealt with a lot of the personal and more like the microeconomic side of environmental movement, like what you can do with your purchasing power and what individuals can do through democratic means, voting, whatnot. Kind of like very small personal decisions. And I got some feedback from several people afterwards that I kind of ignored the other side, this in the corporate responsibility, that I was focusing too much on individual responsibility. So I wanted to write an article from the other side of the fence that, they're obviously personal decisions are very important, but there's also very big entities that don't give a crap what you do personally. They're still going to do what they want to do. So I wanted to provide both sides of it. And the second reason was just my own interest. I read the new book, Green is the New Red by Will Potter, and that kind of catapulted me into this world of the green scare and eco-terrorism and how it's kind of co-opted, following the black scare of the anti-anarchist law and then the red scare, McCarthy era we all know, and now it's the green scare, and environmental movement is seen as like these evil, horrible people. And I know several people who are and have been involved in many direct action environmental groups, and they're they're the most intelligent, thoughtful, caring people I know, and so the labeling of them as terrorists is pretty mind-boggling to me. And just the whole intensity surrounding this issue. So I just wanted to explore it and research it, and I've never seen online or in book form like a summary of like kind of the events, and so I just kind of did it for my own purposes, and then I was like, oh, this is maybe a cool article. And also in that, knowing that I did not at all include everything that's ever been done. It's very much a brief synopsis. There's tons of things that happened in the East Coast and Philadelphia that I didn't include in there. But as far as like the big major events that kind of catapulted the idea of eco-terrorism onto the scene, it's a pretty good summary of all of those events together, which is just, I think, a good way for people to understand it and see it in that form, as opposed to these individual incidents that aren't related to each other, because they are. If that makes sense.
Definitely, I agree. It was definitely a good article, and I got a lot
Thanks,
from
man.
it. In the article, welcome. In the article, you touch on there's essentially the mainstream groups and the kind of the underground, mainstream groups like Greenpeace and the Sierra movement, and groups like the Animal Liberation Front and the Earth Liberation Front. I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's so much conflict between the above ground and underground movements? Because it seems to me that mainstream groups are willing to work within the system and have the radicalism, stuff they want, kind of watered down to and be made more moderate, while the underground groups have much more of a direct impact, even though it is smaller.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? There's so much conflict.
I think you said it. I mean, obviously, ideally, every political movement would be on the same page, would cooperate. There'd be no infighting, but there's that there. I think it really comes down to just philosophy fix. Also, just the fact that I think a lot of the big mainstream environmental groups see the actions of the more direct action groups as threatening to their cause. especially when one knows that most of the major funders and contributors to most of these big groups are some of the main contributors to environmental problems. A sort of paying penance for their crimes, as it may be. So you take some oil baron in Texas who, funds Greenpeace to, say, oh, I care about the environment, and at the same time, there's other environmental groups that are burning up or blowing his oil rigs. It's obviously not going to bode well for him. So there's a pretty obvious conflict of interest, as well as just different philosophies. Do you think that democracy works? Do you think we can vote environmental legislation in and it should work, or do you not think it'll work? A lot of people think that it will work, and you should, democracy is awesome. You should vote and it'll work. If you believe that, you would obviously think that burning shit down is not helpful, but is detrimental to the process. If, however, you think that democracy is a scam and isn't really working, and the corporations are going to do whatever they want, then you're going to be way more inclined to do direct action and not bother with voting or, anything else like that. And it is very interesting.
Yeah,
and
I can definitely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I remember like Greenpeace, they posted rewards actually. There's like a couple things that happened in Northern California. And some of the actions of the Sea Shepherds and Greenpeace would like post bounties for any information leading to their arrest. Just like it's a very obvious public reminder that like we are not affiliated with these people, they have nothing to do with us. But some pretty intense like infighting and acting against each other. There's been actions of ELF people who targeted Greenpeace and Audubon headquarters even. For no other reason than just to say these guys don't know what they're doing, which is obviously unfortunate. It shouldn't be happening, but we're humans. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of the terms. You use the term monkey wrenching a lot. Also, every now and then you use the term eco-tidge. What exactly do those terms mean?
That term came about because of Edward Abbey's book, The Monkey Wrench Gang, written in the late 80s. It's basically Ed Abbey's, he's living vicariously through these passive characters that roam the deserts of the Southwest, and especially Utah, and they blow up bridges, they cut fence, they pull up surveying stakes, they do all sorts of crazy shit, push bulldozers over the edge of cliffs, disable logging equipment. So it's just like this group of these guys that do incredible amount of damage to the logging and oil industry in Utah and Arizona. And that book actually helped launch Earth First, which was like the first direct action campaign. Ed Abbey was we consider him one of the founders, but he's definitely there and influential and very much a big part of the movement. So that term monkey wrenching evolved out of his book, The Monkey Wrench Gang. It basically means any type of direct action that end result is to slow environmental destruction. Monkey wrenching could be anything from pulling up survey stakes to blowing up a bridge to cutting fence. There's a large group of people who consider it their daily task to do small acts of resistance every day. Even though cutting a fence or pulling up a survey stake may not seem like a lot, and thousands of people do small things like that, it equals up to be a big thing. As far as ecotage, it just means sabotage for ecological purposes, really. The reason they used a couple of these different words in the article was to try to dissuade the emphasis on eco-terrorism. It's this huge emotional trigger word that really has no context and can be used for anybody for whatever the purpose is. So try to introduce a couple other terminology to help understand, look at this thing of it. Eco-terrorism, which obviously is throws up red flags and everyone freaks out.
And going off of that term, you bring up the term eco-terrorism. I want to ask, how are such terms, such as like eco-terrorism and the prosecution of environmental activists, used to benefit both corporations, but also the state as well?
If anyone really is interested in that, I highly recommend you read the book Green is the New Red by Will Potter. That's his whole premise of the whole book is exploring this eco-terrorism and what is it. And ultimately, it's undefinable. The government hasn't provided a definition for it or for terrorism at all. It's basically a weapon that definition is based on who's holding it, which is a very dangerous and scary idea. If you do something that disagrees with my ideology and you take direct action against it, I can call you a terrorist. Whether or not your intention is to terrorize or whether or not your intention is even harming humans or beyond at all. This legislation passed, I can't recall the name of it right now, but basically any action that diminishes profits for corporations. So, for example, protesting or blocking a logging road. If you are, like harming the profits of a corporation, you are responsible for making up the profits. So, by laying in the middle of a logging road and stopping logging trucks, you are responsible for the money that the company is losing. So, basically, by peaceful, passive protest, can be considered terrorism under this new wave of legislation that was passed opposed to Operation Backfire. So it's totally ambiguous. There's no real definition, which is why it's really dangerous and really scary. And right now it's eco-terrorism is the big word, but it could be used for any purpose that the state sees fit. If they don't like a group of people and what they're doing, call it terrorism and you can put them in jail for a long time and completely shut their operation down just by calling it terrorism, basically.
Yeah, that definitely is true, and it really makes me think of the legal gymnastics I had to go through, and not just for such a big definition of terrorism as in the Patriot Act, but also, embedding the term unlawful enemy combatant. It's never been heard before, but it's going and essentially invent these terms.
Yeah, I imagine you know a lot more about that than I do.
Now actually going into kind of who's in these organizations and like radical groups. You mentioned kind of a little, just very briefly, kind of the idea of class in these groups, in the sense that more upper class affluent individuals will join groups like mainstream groups, whereas it seems like lower class people will go into direct action. I want to ask, do you think that class plays a role into the ways that people advocate for environmental change, with lower class people being more into direct action? However, I also wanted to kind of follow that up. It's kind of two questions in one. Where it's not only that, but I also want to ask that a lot of these groups, because a lot of these both mainstream and underground groups, they seem to be made up of mainly white male individuals. So, what role do you think race and gender play into the radical environmental movement as well? So pretty much I'm just asking about class and race and gender and how they play into the radical environmental movement.
I kind of touched on it on my article, Rejecting Dystopia, Sustainability in a Changing World. And I really want to, write something else on that. I just hate that being green and being environmentally friendly is associated with being white and affluent. It's so stupid. And it's not just the environmental activism. In my career as a wilderness guide, it's very, very rare to see anybody of color, any minority at all out there. Minority, obviously people who can afford a program like that, they're just not going to send their kid to a wilderness program. It's just not part of the culture, which I think is highly unfortunate, and I don't think I'm an expert at all to speak on like the cultural role of the wilderness and the outdoors that different minority communities have. I know it exists, but I don't think I could speak expertly on it. But yeah, as far as race, it's huge. It is. I personally don't know a single non-white person who's involved in environmental activism, which sucks. I wish I could say I did, but I don't. It's just not something that seems to. Don't know really how else to define it. As far as class, obviously that plays a huge role too.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, the most destructive things and the most unhealthy things are also the cheapest. Like being low class is automatically associated with eating at McDonald's and eating trashy food with and really just the things that are also really huge contributors to environmental degradation are also the cheapest options. And there's tons of reasons for that. We could go into subsidies, whatnot. But yeah, and even knowing about these things is kind of a privilege and associated with class. And the ability to be worrying about more than just your next paycheck or your next meal, or be worried about where the earth could be in 100 years. As far as gender, it's actually my personal experience that the women who are involved in it, in the environmental movement, are pretty badass, are very active, definitely the leaders. Can't really speak actually on like the mainstream groups. I can speak more on like the below ground groups and the members I know and I've been involved with. Women are definitely carrying the torch. And I think a lot of that could be, I don't know, really why. Need to start. What's up?
Yeah, well, that's definitely good. I was going to say it's definitely good to hear that women are just carrying a torch. There may not be a lot of people of color, but I definitely think, like me being black, I definitely think that people need to get involved, and the people of color should definitely get involved in these racialized communities. But it's good to see at least there's some women there. It's
Interesting
good to
thing
know.
you bring up gender that I just thought of. It's really interesting, like the role of women in the radical environmental movement has greatly played an effect on how it's gone about. Like at first with Earth First and all, this is totally male dominated, male driven. It's very ego, very macho, burning shit, blowing shit up, these types of things. And as the movement has progressed, one could argue that it has gotten a lot more, I don't know, wise, a lot less like macho blowing shit up, and a lot more like what's actually an effective but maybe less ego driving way. And a good example would be, I talked briefly in my article about tree spiking, is driving huge nails into trees so that loggers' chainsaws break, so that they don't want to cut down trees because of the cost it would take to replace hundreds of chainsaw blades. That was hugely a male-driven thing, to drive these huge nails into trees and save them. And a lot of the women came in and were like, this is really expensive and it harms trees and it's dangerous because there's potential for chainsaw blades to break and kill people. And they started yarning trees. They take yarn and just wrap them around, and it's way easier, it's cheaper, it doesn't harm the trees, and it's more effective because it gums up the chainsaw blades instead of breaking them, which isn't dangerous. So it's just like one of those little things that the movement's gone on. The women have gotten more involved. One could say the movement has gotten a lot more aware and effective. And yeah, the influence of women's presence is definitely seen, which is, I think, a good thing.
Definitely. What do you think about having the EF, ELF, and ALF as being more being more dangerous to domestic security than Al Qaeda? Or what do you think that says about the nature of the war on terror?
A lot of deductions you could make from that. One, that they never were that big of a threat, and one that's a threat that's one could say has been kind of fabricated for purposes. Yeah, and I think more than anything, it just says like who the people on top are scared of at that present moment than anything. One reason I heard, there was this list, I don't think it's up anymore, but it was up for a while. FBI or TSA or something, they had, I forget which organization it was, had a list of like the top most flagged people who travel, or like reasons you would get flagged for traveling. It was like association with Islamic terrorist groups, anarchist, communist affiliations. There's all these things with which you could be flagged. And at the top of the list was environmental groups, anything having to do with someone that might possibly lead someone to commit an act of eco-terrorism, which is really shocking to me because there's never been a single death or injury in the environmental movement. But apparently they're at the top of the list for things that people are watching out for and flagging for. And my personal opinion of that is that it's completely financial. That eco-terrorism it's very financially damaging. There's not many groups that advocate such rampant destruction and really just costly destruction. There's a lot of groups that do things, that do direct action, but I mean, like burning down a ski lodge and some of these things, like I don't remember where I heard this number, but I heard that there's over $300 million that ELF and ALF have caused in the last 20 years, which is a good number. That's a pretty high number. So I think that it's the financial imperative that people realize that these people are causing like severe damage to their industries, whether or not they're actually harming anybody. That's apparently not a factor, but I think the financial part plays a huge part in that.
Definitely finances always plays a huge part in, in a way, almost any law. Look at the healthcare law, pretty much written by, the healthcare industry. So it's always a problem. My next question is you brought up a quote, and so actually a number of quotes from indigenous activists in the environmental movement. I want to ask, what's the level of involvement of indigenous communities with regards to environmental activism, especially underground
obviously
activism?
Indigenous people everywhere are fighting for just their culture and just their survival, just the world that we live in. There's like a certain amount of resistance that has to happen to even survive. I'm not personally familiar with a lot of groups that are like overtly fighting for beyond their just immediate survival needs. I mean, I can think of this right now, the XL pipeline. I mean, there's a lot of Lakota communities, a lot of American communities that are rallying together for that. But yeah, it's really hard. There's just basically keeping their culture and their family and their language alive is consuming. And obviously, like, their land base is very much connected to that, their identity and their culture. And there's a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
But unfortunately, like, I don't see a large unification, like people uniting with indigenous resistance groups, people communicating together, realizing that they have the same goals. I think that's a huge need right now in the environmental movement, because there are groups and they're resisting, doing what they can, but they don't have resources. No one's hearing about them. No one really cares. And like uniting and getting those voices out and realizing that there's all these groups and these communities and these people fighting in, these direct action ELF groups, as well as these, indigenous people fighting for different things. Getting people on the same page, I think, would be huge. But unfortunately, I don't think it's really happening right now on the level that it could at all. Yeah.
Yeah, there's always definitely room for improvement, room for growth. My last question is what are some of the things people can do on their own to fight back against the destruction of the environment? Besides, at least as you mentioned earlier, it's always buy the Prius, use recycle bags. So I personally don't care about that, and probably some of the people listening to this, or at least people going to Hampton Institute, are probably people who are maybe like that as well. They don't really care about, or they aren't into the whole vote green party. Or,
that's a great question. Glad you asked that. Because in that my French article, emphasis on that,
so
and that's not at all because I don't think it's important. Just trying to present the other side of the argument. I do think personal decisions are very, very important. And what to say just as important as direct action. Well, as far as like some things, I mean, I could throw some things out there, but I say the number one thing is just educate yourself. Just know, I think food is huge. Food is definitely top of the list as far as environmental impact. Knowing what you eat, choosing what you eat, being intentional about what you eat, knowing where it came from, where it's going. Because I mean, all the factors associated with food production are very, very detrimental to the environment. Just simple daily things like recycling, just realizing how much you're using of this or that, or just kind of having a tally and realizing the effect that you personally are having. And then, like, I'm not one to sit here and tell you, like, you should do this or you need to do this at all. Just have awareness of where everything in your life comes from. I just love to ask people, like, who made your shirt? Like, who made your jeans? Who made your lunch? Like, where was that tomato grown? And most people never ask. They don't care. Like, if their shirt was made in Bangladesh by a 4-year-old kid, their tomato was grown in Argentina. Like, what the hell? So it's just asking yourself these questions and challenging, like, every little thing in your life that you use and that you consume. And I think that naturally awareness will lead to awareness engenders action. And the more that you know, the more you're personally going to be led to take action on certain things. That's why I tend to shy away from just telling people to recycle or telling people to do this. Because if it doesn't come from like an awareness or like a passion or a desire to change things, or really just to know, like it just kind of loses its meaning, and it's very short-lived. And it has kind of a gimmick. It's kind of cool now to be green and to recycle and to do these little things. But I think awareness is huge, is key. Because once you know these things, it's not just going to be a gimmick. You're not recycling. You're recycling because you've been to a landfill or you've seen really horrible things. They're like, oh God, me not recycling does that. It's not this abstract thing that makes me good karma points for the earth. So educate, read books, ask questions. Google's awesome. Ask Google lots of things.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Asking questions will always help.
Yeah,
It's definitely a good
thanks
thing
for interviewing
when
me.
questions are asked. But thank you for the interview.
See you around, man.
Welcome. All right, see you next time, Jeriah.